everyone, and welcome to Transcend Liberalism, classical Western liberalism for a new age. And before I begin, I would like to welcome all of my new subscribers to the channel. If you guys have any tips on how I can improve my videos to make them better for you, or if you have a video you would like to see me reply to, leave me a comment. Let me know how I can improve my content for you. I really want to know. I'm genuinely want to know. I want to grow this channel. I want to grow this message. So really, help me out. I would appreciate it. I would love you guys for it. Thank you. Now let's get started.
Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of How to Argue with Conservatives. I'm your host, Taylor Scollin, and today we're talking about the Nordic countries. Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark. Are they socialist? Capitalist? What's going on up there anyway? Let's get into it.
The Nordic countries are capitalist. That was easy. See you guys. Nah, just kidding. I'll debate you.
How to Argue with Conservatives is a web series in which I explain why the left is correct and conservatives are wrong on an important issue or topic.
So, the point of your show is to dictate to your audience what is correct from your subjective opinion. Well, I'm not here to decide for my audience what is the correct view for them. I'm just here to add my own arguments to your idea and let them decide for themselves which is the better position. I think that already shows the stark differences in how we view our ideas. You dictate what is the correct view. I speak and let the viewer decide.
In this episode, I'm talking about the Nordic countries and their economic systems. These countries of Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Norway are all known for having strong social safety nets and welfare systems. They have single-payer healthcare, free college, affordable childcare, and so on.
Just because a country has social safety nets for their citizens doesn't make them socialist. Their programs, however, like education, are not free, as you stated there. The social safety nets are paid for by having a large tax burden placed on its citizens. The wealth that pays for the services provided by the government are generated through capitalism.
And this is why progressive politicians like Bernie Sanders often point to the Nordics as places that we ought to emulate. Now, this poses a real problem for conservatives.
No, it doesn't.
Because the Nordic countries are happy, healthy, prosperous places. Far from the nightmare scenarios of Stalin's Soviet Russia or Maduro's Venezuela. And it's much more difficult to demonize socialism if people believe that socialism existed in practice in places like Sweden.
Socialism does not exist in places like Sweden. One of the countries you listed under the Nordic Model is Denmark, where the Danish Prime Minister is on record of saying that his country is not socialist. And he said this in response to Bernie Sanders claiming that they are. And for you to claim that Denmark is socialist after the leader of its own country said that they are not is a pretty damn presumptuous claim to make.
So what conservatives will often do is try to deal with this by claiming that no, the Nordics are actually more capitalist than the United States or other Anglosphere countries.
They are. In fact, Sweden has no minimum wage laws and a very low corporate tax rate. If Sweden were socialist as you claim, when Saab was going bankrupt, for example, the government would have stepped in and nationalized the auto manufacturer. Instead, they allowed the Chinese to purchase the company so that they could turn it around and make a profit.
For example, a columnist for the National Review, Kevin Williamson, said that the Nordics aren't really socialist at all because a right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation, rated them as being more free market and capitalist.
Because they are more free market and capitalist. Just because you don't like the source and its political leanings doesn't disprove the Heritage Foundation's point. You are engaging in a fallacy called appeal to motive, where you simply reject an argument because of their political views. You need to explain why the Heritage Foundation is wrong, not just tell people that they are. I would imagine a think tank like the Heritage Foundation would be looking for any excuse to say a country with such welfare programs as the Nordic ones are socialist, as you say. Instead, they praise their open markets as being better than America's. That doesn't sound very socialist to me.
But is this really true? Well, it's certainly true that the Nordics are not strictly socialist states in the sense that workers don't have full control over all of the means of production.
You just debunked yourself. Thank you for doing my job for me.
But it's also true that the United States and other Anglosphere countries like Canada or Australia or Britain are not strictly capitalist countries either.
I can't speak for other countries, but here in America, we are a capitalist driven economy. The closest thing we have to public ownership of companies is the stock market, where a company can choose whether or not they want to raise capital for their business. They do this by selling a small portion of ownership. The difference between that and socialism is that socialism uses forced action by the government to seize the means of production.
What we're actually looking at in reality is a spectrum of economic systems. You have capitalism at one end and socialism at the other. And I think if you analyze it from this perspective, you can see that Nordic countries are well towards the socialist end of the spectrum, while the United States is well towards the capitalist end.
Just because a country has a large welfare state does not make them socialist. Socialism, by definition, is the abolishment of private property and full ownership of the production by the populace. Welfare is its own system that can exist in both capitalist and socialist economies, because welfare is not an economic system. Welfare is just a general insurance plan for the population run by the government of that state, territory, or country.
Now, to understand how we come up with this placement of countries along this spectrum, let's look at some of the major elements of their economies. Social services, the labor market, and public ownership over the economy.
Oh, this will be fun.
So the first dimension we want to look at is social services. To analyze this, we can compare how much countries spend on social services as a share of their GDP. This includes spending like things on healthcare, education, welfare, etc. Now, we would expect in socialist countries for the share of spending on social services to be significantly higher than in capitalist countries. You're going to have universal health care, you're going to have free higher education, free childcare, all these sorts of things.
That's not necessarily the case. Take Venezuela, for example. Their budget is 2,747,000,000,000 bolivars. Now that sounds fairly impressive until you look at the value of their currency and realize that Venezuela, with their military, their infrastructure, and all their other social programs, run off the average salary of a registered nurse in the United States. So it's not how much you spend that matters, it's the value of your money that is the main factor. It's no wonder the country is literally suffering under an actual socialist state.
And as expected, in the Nordics, the share of spending on social services is significantly higher than the United States. In the Nordics, we see social spending averaging around 28% of GDP, with a high of just over 30% in Finland. In America, social spending totals only 19.3% of GDP, significantly lower than in all of the Nordic countries. And this is why in America you don't have universal health care or free college or affordable childcare. They're simply not paying for it.
Because we in America believe that making our own decisions with our money is the better option. We've seen our federal government waste money on things like a $7,500 coffee machine, a $600 toilet seat. From my perspective, this sort of spending is irresponsible, and I certainly wouldn't engage with it. I look to be very conservative with how I spend my money, and I try to seek out the best quality product for the cheapest price. My ability to look for a happy medium of quality in relation to price is what makes me the better buyer for myself.
So in terms of social services, I think we can say that the Nordic countries are more socialist than the United States. So now let's turn to the second dimension of the economy we want to look at, which is the labor market. And specifically, we want to look at how many workers in each country are unionized. In a socialist country, we would expect unions to be stronger and larger than in capitalist countries. And when we look at data on the number of workers who are covered by union contracts, we see a stark difference between Nordic countries and the United States.
Labor unions are a part of wage negotiation between employer and employee. If anything, they are the heart of a capitalist society where worker negotiates what they believe their labor is worth versus what the employer is willing to pay. And negotiation is the heart of capitalism because the value of a service or product is agreed upon by both parties involved. Touching on Venezuela again, their labor unions are being decimated by Maduro, who is looking to dictate the value of their labor. I'll read this NPR article here and quote, President Maduro is a former bus driver and union leader, surprise, while his predecessor Hugo Chavez promised to lead a revolution on behalf of the workers, but now many independent labor unions are in open revolt over contract disputes, low wages that can't keep up with inflation, and government repression. Imagine my shock. The Chavez and Maduro governments have long viewed independent unions as a threat to their power and tried to co-opt or replace them with pro-government syndicates. But guess what? It's no longer working. That is why the country is in open revolt. That is the difference between socialism and capitalism. Socialism dictates. Capitalism negotiates.
In America, only 11.9% of workers are covered by union contracts. But in the Nordics, an average of over 80% of workers are covered by union contracts, with a high of 93% in Finland. That's nearly everyone employed in the economy. So the character of the labor market is also more socialist in Nordic countries than in the United States.
The presence of labor unions do not make a country socialist. A labor union's purpose is collective bargaining on behalf of the workers. Labor unions are not interested in abolishing private property or seizing the means of production, because if the workers seized their production, it would make unions obsolete, as everybody would be entitled to a share of the labor. Unions need capitalism to thrive. Otherwise, you're just bargaining with yourself.
On two dimensions now, we see that the Nordics are quite far along the spectrum towards socialism, while the United States is closer to capitalism.
All you've done on two dimensions is tell people that welfare and labor unions are somehow economic systems. You have yet to show any connection to the economic theory of socialism and how the Nordic regions have implemented said theory.
So let's now turn to the third dimension of the economy, and maybe the most important, which is public ownership. Here we're looking at a key pillar of a socialist economy. How much of it is owned and controlled by the public? Now, it's conservative dogma that state ownership of anything is a travesty that must be avoided at all costs because it inevitably leads to gulags and breadlines.
We do have public ownership of corporations in America. It's called stocks. And anyone is capable of buying stock in a company and becoming part owner of that business. That's how we do public ownership in America. The difference between socialist public ownership and capitalist public ownership is that the company gives consent for public ownership in a capitalist society, whereas the socialist government seizes it, usually by force. Now to your hyperbole about state ownership. It is a detriment to society again. Look at the economic situation of any socialist government like Cuba and Venezuela, and you will see economic stagnation and poverty. To counter your point that public ownership is needed for a prosperous economy, let's look at Uruguay. Up until 2003, was run by a socialist government, had poverty of over 36%. That's down to just under 10% since they opened up their economy to private business and investment. The 15 years since Venezuela went socialist and Uruguay went capitalist shows the stark contrast of what makes a vibrant economy. In 15 years, Uruguay's economy has surged fourfold from 2003. Venezuela, on the other hand, is making the Great Depression look like a minor inconvenience.
Well, it turns out that Nordic countries have quite high rates of public ownership of the economy, and no gulags or breadlines to be found. Take a look at this chart. Here we have the value of state-owned businesses as a share of GDP. Now, what's a state-owned business? It's just a business in which the state has a significant minority stake or a controlling stake in certain circumstances. Now, these businesses often include things like the postal service or alcohol retail stores, but they also include businesses that you might think would be privately owned. For example, the Norwegian government owns a 44% share of a company called Adapter that makes accessories for blind people. Now, in Norway, these state-owned businesses are valued at 87.9% of GDP. In Finland, it's 52.3%. Compare that to the United States, where state-owned businesses account for just 0.4% of GDP. They're almost non-existent.
What you deceptively neglect to tell your audience is that the Nordic governments only own stocks in these companies. They do not run or govern the business. The Nordic governments leave that to the managers and board of directors. The Nordic governments are simply taking public money and investing it into these companies. In the US, it's not our government's constitutional role to provide public money as a means to invest in companies. That decision is left up to the average citizen whether or not they feel that making an investment in that business is the best choice for them.
Now let's look at the financial assets under the control of the governments of each of these countries. You can see in this chart that Norway controls financial assets valued at over $1 trillion. That's 331% of their GDP. Finland has over 300 billion of assets, around 130% of GDP.
Now imagine what the citizens of those countries could do with that wealth if it was returned to them. They could certainly pay off the debts that could soon sink them. Using your own source from OECD, Denmark has an average household debt of 320% of their GDP. That's insane. Norway and Sweden are coming in at 215% and 171% respectively. America is only 113%.
And the United States, its assets total just 25% of GDP. And it's important to note that these financial assets owned by the Nordic governments are actually democratically controlled to a certain extent. For example, Norway's social wealth fund controls over $1 trillion in assets, and the Norwegian central bank recently told the government that they should consider divesting from investments in fossil fuels.
Which would be a massive hit to their economy, as Norway is a large exporter of oil. Norway exports 1.5 million barrels of oil a day. Oil is what's really driven their current economic state.
The Norwegian government said it would consider the proposal, and because Norway's government is democratically elected, the public actually has a significant influence over whether this proposal is accepted or rejected.
And if you own stock in an American company, you too have the power of a vote to decide how that company is run.
So in some very real, concrete ways, much of the economies of these Nordic countries are under some level of democratic control. Now, whether we should call this socialism or not, I don't really know, but it's certainly not capitalism.
So, if you don't know, why have you been pushing the idea that these countries are socialist? And how can you claim that they're not capitalist?
And one thing that is clear is that on all these major dimensions of the economy, the Nordic countries are far more socialist than the United States.
You just claimed you didn't know if they were socialist. Now you're affirming that they are. Will you pick a position already, please?
Now, I think this is bad news for conservatives because America, which is a much more capitalist country, struggles with millions of people without health care, underfunded public schools, high infant mortality rates, and the highest incarceration rate in the world.
We have one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world, but we are not the highest. That would fall to either China or North Korea, only they don't publish their incarceration numbers. We can make that assumption based on how their government handles civil dissent. But our problems with incarceration fall to morality legislation and bans on marijuana and prostitution. I'm for ending the drug prohibition and making prostitution legal. What a consenting adult puts into their body is none of my business. I advocate consent-based laws over prohibition. It falls in my line with views of personal choice.
Meanwhile, in the more socialist Nordic countries, people live longer, they're better educated, and they report some of the highest levels of happiness anywhere in the world.
But good luck finding a job in countries like Sweden.
For almost 100 years, conservatives have been fear-mongering about socialism with images of gulags and breadlines. But in the 21st century, it appears that it's socialism, not capitalism, that's really delivering the goods. Okay, well that does it for this episode of How to Argue with Conservatives.
What about France and Italy? I guess their brand of Euro social welfare just doesn't work with your narrative? Is it because of the rough economic climate that they as a nation are currently experiencing? Is that why you neglected to mention them? You found the one model that's currently in a functioning state and jumped on the idea. What you've done this whole video is build one giant association fallacy in that because X works, Y must work as well. Sorry there, mate. Arguments don't work that way. So, in conclusion, you've stated twice that the Nordic model is socialism, even though you stated previously that you weren't sure, in addition to debunking your own argument in the beginning of the video. Personally, I'm not conservative. I'm like a centrist libertarian. So I can't speak for conservatives you've proven wrong, but something tells me it's only because they've been the strawman conservatives you imagine in your head. Thanks for watching.